I was a senior in college at Western Michigan University in 1973. I was on the track team there, and I was in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Ran into an old high school friend, and he started going on and on about about the end times. And a book that was very popular in the 1970s came out in 1970 by Hal Lindsey called The Late Great Planet Earth. And in that book, Lindsey made something of a prediction. He said that the key to Bible prophecy in our time was Israel becoming a nation again in 1948. And then he went to Matthew chapter 24, verse 34, where it says, "This generation will not pass away until all these things take place." Said that Israel was the fig tree generation, and a generation was 40 years. And so when you add 40 to 1948, you got 1988. So this was, for me, it was 1973. So in 15 years, everything was supposed to come to an end. And I was when I say I was a new Christian, I was brand spanking new. I didn't know much about anything in 1973. And, so that was something I kind of held on to because that's all I had heard and didn't really know that many people as to how to deal with all this. But I eventually went to seminary in 1974 at Reformed Theological Seminary in Jackson, Mississippi. And, I picked up a couple of books I had some commentaries, and I looked at Matthew chapter 24, verse 34. I started reading the New Testament, Matthew 10:23, Matthew 16:27 through 28. And I said, wait a minute, these passages seem to indicate that some eschatological event was very, very near before the last disciples died, as Matthew chapter 10:23 and Matthew 16:27, 28 said. And it says, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. And Jesus was obviously talking to his disciples. He used the second person plural, when you see this, when you see this, when you see this. And I was terribly confused. And so I went to the library and picked up a commentary by William Hendrickson on Matthew, and I read his comments on Matthew chapter 24. And that wasn't much help at all. He kept quoting the Old Testament and never really dealt with how the New Testament used the phrase, this generation, especially in the Gospel of Matthew. And again, I didn't know enough to ask the right kinds of questions. And then I saw our librarian had put a little book out on the cart that he was selling. It was by Marcellus Kick, and it had on the spine, all it says was Matthew 24. And I bought it, and I read it. And after reading that book, it completely changed my understanding of Bible prophecy, and also helped immensely just with the issue of how you interpret the Bible. Because Marcellus Kick said you interpret the Bible by using the Bible. And that's what he did. He went through Matthew chapter 24, the Olivet Discourse, verse by verse, and showed how Jesus was describing not some future generation, but he was describing that particular generation, because every time this generation is used in the Gospels, it always refers to the generation to whom Jesus is speaking. It never refers to a future generation. And so at that point, it became fundamental in my interpretive, the way I was doing things was to read Scripture in those terms. And as I matured in the faith, finally graduated and so forth, I got involved in worldview issues. How does the Bible apply to every area of life? And almost every time I dealt with worldview issues, invariably somebody would come back and say, why, this is all predicted in the Bible. Why are you concerned about education and politics and science and morality and all these types of things? Because Jesus is coming back soon. I mean, Hal Lindsey said before 1988. And so I saw that there were this world implications to bad eschatology. And so I ended up, kind of specializing in this topic and wrote Last Days Madness as a way to get people re-engaged in the Bible to see how the Bible does deal with the topic of Bible prophecy.
Wow, and I think that a lot of us have had similar journeys. We grow up being taught, preacher of rapture, some sort of futurism. And we've got all these questions, and it just doesn't make sense. We look at the Bible, and then we look at what it's teaching. And we're like, but we haven't had that time where it's a different view is laid out for us. And for you, it was Marcella's kick, and it seems like everybody kind of has that breakthrough moment. They'll either hear a teaching or read a book. There's different books out there that are on this subject, and all of a sudden that light bulb goes off. Like, hey, this is not talking about that. And my breakthrough, just so everybody knows, was actually going to an End Times conference in 2013, and Gary Demar was speaking, and he presented audience relevance. What did this mean to the original audience? And I'd never considered that before. I read the Bible like it was written directly to me, and whenever I literally reread the entire Bible in light of audience relevance. What did this mean to the original audience? And so many questions were answered. So, absolutely. Well, thanks for sharing that, Gary. And you had mentioned Matthew 24:34. Now, this is probably the most important time statement that Jesus made. I mean, this literally, if this generation is referring to the first century generation, then that completely invalidates the futurist understanding that Matthew 24 is happening right now or will happen in the future. And one of the main arguments that I hear whenever I present that is they say, well, Jesus actually meant this race will not pass away until all these things take place. So what would you say to that person?
Yeah, that was very popular in the Schofield Reference Bible. Jesus was referring to the race, that is, the Jewish race will not pass away until all these things take place. And there are several problems with that interpretation. First, the Greek word that's used. The Greek word for race is genos. And the Greek word for genea, for generation, is genea. And the first time genea is used in Matthew's gospel, it talks about the generations leading up to the birth of Jesus. There are so many generations. There are so many generations. Well, genea in that context means generations. It can't mean race. If you were to plug in the definition of race into that, it would make absolutely no sense at all. And every time Jesus uses the phrase "this generation" in Matthew's gospel, it always means the generation to whom he is speaking. In Matthew 12, it's verse 41. It says, "The men of Nineveh shall stand up with this generation at the judgment and shall condemn it, because they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and behold, something greater than Jonah is here." Well, no other generation is going to be condemned because no other generation had Jesus there right in front of them. And I had a debate with Thomas Ice, who is a dispensationalist and holds a view contrary to mine. And in a radio debate with him, he said, "Gary, I agree with you. Every time Jesus uses the phrase "this generation," in the Gospels, it always refers to the generation to whom Jesus is speaking, except in Matthew chapter 24, verse 34. And you can't interpret the Bible that way. There's another problem with interpreting as race, because dispensationalists believe that the Jewish race is the paramount interpretive issue regarding their eschatological position. So let's plug in the word race. And it said, the Jewish race will not pass away until all these things take place, which means when all those things take place, the Jewish race passes away. Well, it can't pass away in their system, so it makes no logical sense. Now, other people will say, well, what this means is the generation that sees these signs will not pass away until all these things take place. That's Tim LaHaye's interpretation and Tommy Ice's interpretation. The problem with that is you have to take out the word "this," which is a near demonstrative and refers to things related to something that's near. And you have to add words, the generation that sees these signs. Well, in the previous verse, we're told which generation it was to see all these signs. Verse 33 of Matthew chapter 24. It's as clear as can be. It says, "Even so, you too," audience relevant, Jesus is speaking to that particular audience, when you, again, speaking to that audience, when you see all these things, recognize that it is near, right at the door. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. So there's no getting around what Matthew 24, 33, and 34 mean. Jesus is referring to that generation. And by the way, Marcellus Kick wasn't the first person to come up with this interpretation. Nearly all the older Bible commentaries saw that Matthew chapter 24 referred to events leading up to and including the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70.
Yes, and in your book, I was fortunate enough to kind of see an early copy of the Wars and Rumors Awards that's coming out. You actually list all of those quotes. Doesn't it go back to 200 AD, I believe?
Oh yeah, you can trace it all the way back, and you'll see that they applied it to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, and all the major commentaries. Maybe a lot of your listeners aren't aware of, but these are people who wrote commentaries on the entire Bible: Thomas Scott and John Gill, and Doddridge. You see in Wars and Rumors of Wars, I don't know how many 5 or 6 pages of quotations from Bible commentaries showing that what the Olivet Discourse is describing is events leading up to and including the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. And we have to remember that liberals used Matthew chapter 24:34 as an attempt to discredit what Jesus was saying, because they said, just like dispensationalists say, well, Jesus was wrong. He said this generation will not pass away until all these things take place, and it didn't happen, and so that Jesus was in fact wrong. And in a debate that Douglas Wilson had with the late Christopher Hitchens tried to bring that up and say, look, Jesus was wrong about that. And Douglas Wilson said, not at all. Jesus was referring to his own generation. Jesus was using language right out of the Old Testament that describes the very things that Jesus said would happen to Jerusalem when the temple was destroyed and it was completely dismantled stone upon stone, just like Jesus said it would take place.
Absolutely. No, it doesn't make any sense to change that. And also what comes to mind is in Luke 17, which is kind of a little, it's not a parallel of Matthew 24, but we kind of have a little minor parallel there. And in Luke 17, 25, it says, but first he, being Jesus, must suffer many things and be rejected by this generation. So literally, in the same conversation that he said all these things will happen before this generation passes away, he also says that he has to be rejected by this generation. And we know that the generation that rejected him was obviously that first century generation. So why would it, in the same conversation when he uses that same term, he's talking about a generation 2,000 years in the future? I mean, that's kind of all over the place there.
In fact, Luke has 3 references to the destruction of Jerusalem referring to that particular generation. You mentioned Luke 17, but also in Luke 19, there is Luke 19:41. It says, and when he approached, he saw the city, meaning Jerusalem, and wept over it, saying, if you had known in this day, even you, the things which make for peace, but now they have been hidden from your eyes. For the days shall come upon you when your enemies will throw up a bank before you and surround you and hem you in on every side, and will level you to the ground and your children within you, and they will not leave in you one stone upon another, because you did not recognize the time of your visitation. I mean, how many times does Jesus have to say this in order for people to get it, that he was describing things related to that particular generation? Now, that doesn't mean there isn't application to us just because something has already been fulfilled. I mean, Jesus died on the cross and there was all types of prophecies fulfilled. It doesn't mean that Jesus' death on the cross doesn't have any relevance for us today. But let's be clear that those prophecies related to the first coming of Jesus and his death and resurrection and ascension, that's fulfilled prophecy. And Jesus' description of events related to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 is fulfilled prophecy. They're lessons for us, but those lessons are based upon fulfilled prophecy.
Yes, the way that I've always heard it said, and it just stuck with me, is, the Bible was written for us. It's written for our benefit. There are many dual applications, but it wasn't written to us. It was written to the original audience. And before we try to interpret anything, especially verses related to prophecy, we need to at least ask that question. What could this have meant to the original audience? Is there a chance that it only had a fulfillment in the first century? And that's really helped me out a lot. But they had the Holy Spirit. We have the Holy Spirit. They were saved by grace through faith. We're saved by grace through faith. So there's many things that carry over even today. But if we just assume that everything is for us today, we get into some trouble. And here's the next thing. I just want to jump right into probably one of the most controversial subjects that I've blogged about and I've talked about with people. This one, and I'm sure you've seen this, just gets people really, really going, and it's the Great Tribulation period. You look around with, instability in the Middle East and, persecution of Christians around the world, and a lot of people would say, this is it. This is the Great Tribulation that Jesus prophesied about. And what would you say to that person?
Well, again, we're back to Matthew chapter 24 and verse 34, where it says, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. And one of all these things is Great Tribulation. It doesn't say the Great Tribulation, it just says Great Tribulation. And the issue there is, again, the context. Look at the context of it. How do you get away from this Great Tribulation? The context is extremely important here. Verse 15, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not go down to get the things out that are in his house. And let him who is in the field not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those who are with child and to those who nurse babes in those days. But pray that your flight may not be in the winter or on the Sabbath. Now, is this a worldwide tribulation? Absolutely not. This is a local tribulation. And the reason it's called the greatest tribulation that ever was or ever will be, because it completely ended the entire redemptive, old covenant redemptive system that was put in place to identify who the Messiah was, who was going to replace the temple, who was the Lamb of God who took away the sins of the world. He was the high priest after the order of Melchizedek. The reason it was such a great tribulation, that everything related to the old covenant was completely dismantled. And by the way, that same language is used in the book of Ezekiel when it describes the destruction of the first temple. And I think it's Ezekiel chapter 5, verse 9. This is the same language. Verse 9, because of all your abominations, I will do among you what I have not done, and the like of which I will never do again. So that same language was used to identify the desolation that was going to take place in the temple in Israel's day that sent them into exile. It's been described as a rhetorical superlative. It's hyperbole, and we used that sort of language before. You look in the Old Testament about this was the greatest king who ever was or ever will be, and then another king comes along and it says, and this is the king who greatest king who ever was or ever will be. Solomon comes along and says of him, he was the greatest king who ever was or ever will be. Yet when you get into the New Testament, it says of Jesus, someone greater than Solomon is here. So again, letting the Bible interpret itself, using the Bible, verses from the Bible that are similar, and you come up and say, look, Jesus, this is a way to describe how bad this thing was going to be and how overturning it was going to be for the world of Israel. They had to now identify themselves with a new temple, a new sacrifice, and a new priesthood. This tribulation was an awful, awful thing that happened to them. In fact, John in the book of Revelation, in the first chapter, says he's a fellow partaker in the tribulation. This was something that was happening in that first century. Now, does this mean that persecution and tribulation that's taking place around the world today is irrelevant to that? Absolutely not. But that's not what Jesus is describing in Matthew chapter 24.
Absolutely, and that's often one of the things that I hear is people, as soon as you say, "Oh, the Great Tribulation took place before the generation Jesus was speaking who passed away," then they say, "Are you saying there's no tribulation around the earth? There's these Christians being martyred and all sorts of wars and things, and we pray for those people, and we don't deny that those people are experiencing tribulation." But Jesus gave a very specific context to this tribulation. It would take place within a generation. And if you look at the Roman destruction of Jerusalem between AD 66 and AD 70, 1.1 million people were brutally murdered. Just the worst. Obviously the Holocaust would be worse, but like what Gary was saying, covenantally speaking, this was devastating. Their temple was destroyed, taken down one stone upon another. Jerusalem, the holy city, was just bathed in it's kind of grotesque, but bodies. The Romans were just crucifying Christians left, or some were Christians somewhere, but crucifying those who were in Jerusalem left and right. This was a very severe persecution, and covenantally speaking, nothing like this had ever happened and will ever happen again for the Jewish nation. So absolutely. So thank you for answering that. And here's what I want to do is I've got a few more questions for Gary tomorrow, but I know that there's some people probably just like, man, I have to ask Gary something. I understand. So I'm gonna go and have you enter 5-star, and that's gonna cause you to raise your hand on my computer here. 5-star if you have a question, and I'm gonna ask you a few more questions, and as soon as I'm done, I'm gonna pull you on the line to ask your question. You can just, and even if you just want to say hey and just give some comments on something that has been said, and we're just gonna jump right to one because we got somebody right here. Okay, you ready, Gary?
Yes, sure.
Okay, awesome. All right. Let's see here. Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah, Jordan.
Hey, how are you? Who is this?
This is Jimmy Schools.
Jimmy Schools. How are you, brother?
Doing great. Enjoying this.
Yeah, man, it's so awesome just to hear context for a change. Yeah, man. So go ahead with your question.
Great. Gary, two of the things, I'm sort of going to lump two questions in here, if I could. The two of the things that I run into with talking with people about this is being accused of teaching replacement theology. And the second part of that is I hear a lot of people talking about the Gog and Magog kind of thing out of Ezekiel. If you could take a few minutes to address that.
Sure. Yeah. The replacement theology charge is the dispensational case of playing the race card. It's like, you believe the Jews don't count anymore, and that's just not the case at all. And that the church has superseded Israel, which isn't the case at all. And a lot of it comes down to just not reading the Bible clearly. And I always ask the question, this is the first question I ask. Who were the first Christians in the New Testament? And the answer to that is Jews. There were Jews living in Jerusalem from every nation under heaven. That's an interesting phrase on itself, and we can talk about that later on. So the first people to hear the gospel were Jews. The first people to present the gospel were Jews. The first Christians were Jews. If you look at Acts chapter 5, it's the church in Jerusalem. So the idea of the church was made up almost exclusively of Jews. Chapter 5 and also in chapter 8, there was again talks about the church that was in Jerusalem after the persecution, after the death and persecution of Christians. There were Jews scattered, Jewish Christians scattered throughout the Roman Empire. So, what happens later on? Peter gets is instructed to take the gospel now to the Gentiles, to the nations, and he's reluctant to do this. He's a first century Jonah. It's Simon Bar Jonah, and he is at Joppa at this particular period of time. The same place where Jonah was while he was reluctant to go to Nineveh. God, brings down this sheet, and it was unclean animals, and he tells Peter, take, kill, and eat. And Peter says, I've never eaten any unclean thing. Don't call unclean what I call clean. So Peter gets the message. Now the gospel goes to the nations, and so the gospel goes to the nations. Peter preaches the gospel. Paul preaches the gospel to the nations, the Gentiles. And what happens to those Gentile Christians? They are grafted in, Romans chapter 11, they are grafted into an existing Jewish ecclesia, which was often translated as a church, unfortunately. And so the church doesn't supersede or replace Israel. The first Christians were in fact made up almost exclusively of Israelites, which was a fulfillment of Bible prophecy, and also Gentiles being grafted in was also a fulfillment of Bible prophecy. So there is no supersession in the Bible. There's no replacement theology in the Bible. And now let's get back to the word ecclesia. William Tyndale, when he translated the Bible, he wanted to translate ecclesia, which is a Greek word which we translate as church. He wanted to translate it as congregation or assembly, because when the Old Testament was translated from Hebrew into Greek, the Hebrew word kahal was translated as ecclesia. So the congregation that was in the wilderness, remember Stephen talks about the congregation or the church that was in the wilderness. He uses the word ecclesia there because the word kahal, and under the Old Covenant, which referred to the assembly, the congregation of believers under the Old Covenant, was the Greek translation of that was ecclesia. And so the church, the ecclesia, wasn't anything new in the New Testament. When Jesus says, tell it to the church in Matthew chapter 18, they knew exactly what Jesus was saying. Tell it to the kahal, to the ecclesia, to the congregation of God. This idea of supersessionism and replacement theology is just a myth. I certainly don't teach that. The first Christians were in fact made up of Israelites. Gentiles were grafted into an existing church. I debated Dr. Michael Brown on this a couple of years ago, and he had written this article on replacement theology, and I've written extensively on this. And you can search online. I've got an article or two on replacement theology, and I was kind of shocked. He agreed with everything I said about this replacement theology, but he never acknowledged that he was wrong in labeling people like me as someone who believes in replacement theology, because I don't. The church doesn't replace Israel. The ecclesia has always been referred to in relationship to Israel. Now, to the Gog and Magog prophecy in Ezekiel 38 and 39, that's a much bigger issue. I've written a book on this called The Gog and Magog End Time Alliance, Israel, Russia, and Syria in Bible Prophecy. And again, Ezekiel 38 and 39 is not talking about modern-day Russia. The word Rosh in Ezekiel 38 and 39 is not a reference to Russia. If you'll read Ezekiel 38 and 39, you'll notice that all the armaments are ancient. They're on horseback. They're bows and arrows, chariots. You can't turn bows and arrows into missiles and missile launchers. It's just absolutely ridiculous how people have interpreted Ezekiel 38 and 39. It's an ancient battle that took place a long time ago, and it's my contention, and I base my interpretation on some work that James Jordan did on the book of Esther, and he says that the Ezekiel 38 and 39, the Gog and Magog prophecy, is actually a description of what Haman was going to do to the Jews. And if you look at Esther chapter 3, and you will see in Esther chapter 3 that Haman wanted to kill every single Jew in the Persian Empire. And it was because of Esther and Mordecai, who stood up against Haman, that plan was averted. And the idea, there's just so much. You have to, again, I can't go through all of it, but there's an interesting little concept in Ezekiel 38 and 39, and that is this Haman-Gog. And Haman-Gog is, in fact, the Haman in the book of Esther. And again, the name of the book is The Gog and Magog End Time Alliance, Israel, Russia, and Syria and Bible prophecy. I guarantee you after reading this book, it'll completely change the way that you look at the Gog and Magog prophecy. And you can get it at AmericanVision.org, and it's the Gog and Magog End Time Alliance, and it's an interpretive analysis of Ezekiel 38 and 39 related to the book of Esther.
Great. All right. Thank you.
Awesome. That was a really, really good set of questions, Jimmy. Thank you, brother. Thanks for joining us. And we got somebody else. If you do have a question, we'd love to hear from you, or just to say hey. If you had anything to comment about what's been said, just want to add something to what's been said, we would love to hear from you. Just hit 5-star. Love to introduce yourself, and so we can all say hey to you. And we've got another question here. And this is awesome, guys. Thank you so much for taking time out tonight. And we're going to keep answering some of the more hot topics. And let's see here. Hey there.
Hi, my name's Michelle Donovan. How's everybody?
Michelle, how are you?
Doing well?
Thank you for doing this. This is awesome. My question is, since this whole subject and the truth is so freeing, you find yourself wanting to tell everybody, and the posture in sharing this can be really difficult. You know, when to say it. I've been in groups of people. In fact, I just recently joined a Bible study group and bought a book for it, and did not know until I got the book the night before the study. I opened it, read the foreword, and the first sentence said something about the end times. And I'm like, oh my gosh, what did I get myself into? I mean, this was a women's group, and so I was able to share that my view was very different after they'd had some discussion going, and just posed a few questions from Matthew 24 and got them thinking. But other than that, how do you handle this? I mean, what is the best way? I have a friend that she read Raptureless and still is just keeps going back to, well, how do you explain this? And goes back to the same questions, and she won't budge from it. And so how do you handle it? And without being, if you want to do it in love, or there's no sense even doing it, and sharing it.
Well, you have to be patient. And it's a hard thing to do. And I find a lot of people who have come to a particular position after being in another position, that they're like ex-smokers. People smoke for 20 years, and all of a sudden they quit and they see somebody smoking, and they're so impatient with them. And yet they were addicted to, smoking cigarettes for 20 years, and they want this person to stop right away. It just doesn't work that way. And the second thing I always did, and you did the right thing with the second thing I'm going to do. Do you ever see the detective show Columbo?
Yes.
with Peter Falk. Peter Falk, he came in with this rumpled, trench coat on, and all he did was ask questions. And what you need to do is you need to do the Columbo routine. I'm looking at this verse, and
I love it.
It says this here, and and Jesus uses the same verse over here, and what does it mean there? And you just ask questions, and what you're doing is planting seeds of doubt. I'll give you just a brief story. I was doing an interview on a Florida station a number of years ago, and this man called in, and he was angry at me, spitting angry at me, because you have to remember something. The people who hold to a particular theological position, especially one dealing with eschatology, oftentimes their entire theological perspective is wrapped up in that position. And so when you start chipping away at the foundation of something that is linked to so many other things that they believe, it shakes their faith a little bit. And so this is why a lot of people get very nervous. And this guy was just angry with me. And it was probably, I'd done these things for many, many years, and so this wasn't anything new. And but 6 months later, I got an email from this person apologizing and basically said, look, I'm I've never heard this before, and I'm sorry I was angry and all that, and now I understand what you were saying, and he changed his position.
Awesome. What's the video series? What's the name of that you did?
I think it just, I don't even remember my own stuff. I think it's just called An Introduction to Bible Prophecy. Let me just see here if I can find it. It's, just by, Gary Demar.
I have it. I know what you're speaking of. Yeah, it's on AmericanVision.org. You've got like a crash course in Bible prophecy. Is that it?
Let's see. I'm not sure here. It's a video series. It's done a few years ago. There's outlines that go with it too, and it's you can get them, and it'll take you through Matthew 24, kind of like I'm doing a little bit, tonight. I have a little booklet called A Beginner's Guide to Interpreting Bible Prophecy. It might be something you want to give to a friend and say, look, just read this. It's just a 5-part, very short study on how to interpret Bible prophecy. It's very easy to read. There are images in it and so forth and so on. Very helpful. I can't find right now just exactly what the video series is, but if you look online under my name, you'll be able to find it.
Okay, thank you so much.
And also, Michelle?
Mm-hmm.
You still there? I was also
Yep, I'm here.
one thing. I really like what Gary said about just kind of being like, well, I'm just kind of looking at this, and what about this verse? And that was very awesome. And just to encourage you, also what Gary said about patience.
Yes.
I don't want to say who it was, but I have a family member, a very close family member, that literally, whenever I first told them, this is about 2014, that I was doubting the pre-trib rapture, I was saying things differently, literally, and keep in mind, back in the day, I had literally no idea how to talk about this stuff, okay? I got uncomfortable, they got uncomfortable. I was like, hey, I gave the history, like, the pre-trib rapture was invented in the 1830s, and I didn't really know a whole lot of stuff, so they felt uncomfortable. But this person literally left my house. They got so mad that I was challenging their belief, and this is somebody who believed the pre-trib rapture for probably 40 years, okay? And it's been literally, 14, 15, 16, 17, here we are in July. So literally about a 4-year process. And I just had a breakthrough, and I want to tell you what the breakthrough was, because it took so long. This person would not even talk to me about prophecy, and they know that I'm writing a book on it. They know that I write blogs, and this person loves me, but they don't want to hear about it. Because what I learned is that he thought that I was believing some weird, out there, new age, weird belief. Whatever is not the pre-trib rapture, to him, has to be just something crazy. So what I did, and we had a breakthrough conversation about 2 weeks ago, is I said, do you have hope for the future? And he said, well, of course I have hope for the future. I said, I know you do. I know you do. I said, okay. And I said, do you believe that the kingdom of God is here? Do you believe that Jesus is ruling and reigning, and, heaven is coming to earth? And the church that we grew up in, that's what they taught, even though their eschatology didn't teach that. And he said, well, of course. And I said, okay, well, that's what I believe. I said, we believe the same thing. I believe that the Bible teaches that there's hope for the future. And I believe that a lot of the stuff that is taught to say that the future is just full of tribulation, it's full of problems, things are going in a downward spiral, I believe that those things were talking about stuff that happened in the past. And suddenly, he was disarmed. You see what I'm saying? I went down to his level.
Yeah.
And I showed him that, hey, we're actually on the same team here. We actually believe the same exact thing. And you want to know what happened? You had mentioned rapture. Is this Michelle Beth Cuss?
No, Michelle Donovan, nope. But I am
Donovan,
a Welton student. I'm a Welton,
okay, yeah,
a Weltonite.
Michelle Beth Cuss. and I heard Michelle something, so Michelle Donovan. I want to write your last name down. Okay, awesome. But anyways, basically you mentioned Raptureless. Well, this person actually asked to read Raptureless, which was written by a guy named Jonathan Welton, and he actually made the book free. And for him to want to read Raptureless, you don't know Michelle. Going from 4 years of this person running out of the house, angry at me, literally yelling, saying, I don't even want to talk about this ever again. And just anytime I mention prophecy, it's just been the subject that just, you can just feel, you can cut the tension with a knife. But what I'm saying is a lot of people, if you'll show them that you actually believe the same, if they believe there's hope for the future, then suddenly their wall goes down. And then suddenly you can say, okay, so about Matthew 24, what about, like Gary was saying, well, what about all these things will happen before that generation passes away? Doesn't that make sense? And until their guard is down, which takes time, it's based on the person, they're not going to hear probably a whole lot that you're going to say. But if you pray about it and you find out what it takes to get their guard down, slowly but surely, you plant those seeds of doubt, and like Gary said, in what they're believing, you'll start to see fruit. So just hang in there, and so
That's good.
It can take 4 years sometimes. But
Okay, Michelle,
Thank you. That was really good.
the name of the series is Basic Training for Understanding Bible Prophecy. Basic Training for Understanding Bible Prophecy, and it's on sale right now. We have a 2-day sale going on, and you can get it at AmericanVision.org, and it has different formats. You can order the DVD series, you can get an MP4 video download, or you can do streaming video, but it's called Basic Training for Understanding Bible Prophecy. This also comes with outlines. Every lesson I outline. The lessons aren't very long. They're like 20 minutes in length. There are images that you'll see through this as well. So I'm up there talking, but at the same time, it's a very good series, and it's very helpful. So it's basic training for understanding Bible prophecy, AmericanVision.org.
Yes.
Got it. Thank you.
Well, Michelle, thank you for being so awesome and calling in and sharing, the struggle, because it is a real struggle. And that's part of the reason I created this call, is we're all trying to, figure out ways to better get this message of hope to people. So awesome. Well, thank you, Michelle. I've got another, thank you. And I've got another question here, Gary. Are you still good on time?
Sure.
Okay, awesome. I so appreciate this. All right. Let's see here. Hey there.
Hey, how's it going, guys?
Hey, we're doing well.
This is Brant. So.
Hey, Brant, what's up, man?
Hey, yeah. So, I wanted to ask you about the mark of the beast. My brother just told me this today, that they're putting the microchips in the hands, and there's a lot of fear about the mark of the beast coming to the world and stuff. So what is your opinion on all that?
Again, I can only talk on this a little bit. If you search online under my name and microchips and so forth, I've got some articles on it. But let me just go very quickly. This comes out of the book of Revelation, chapter 13, and the way to interpret the book of Revelation is to look at when it was written. And the book of Revelation was most definitely written prior to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. The temple is still standing. Revelation chapter 11, John is told to measure the temple. The temple was destroyed in AD 70, so the book of Revelation couldn't have been written after AD 70. It was written before the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. The mark, if you look at the mark, there are two beasts. In Revelation chapter 13, there are two beasts. There's the beast that comes up out of the sea, and there's the beast that comes up out of the land. And then the mark of the beast is the number 666, not 666, but 666. And it's to be on your hand and on your forehead. Now, where does that come from? Where does this idea of putting a mark on your hand and your forehead, where is that found in the Bible? Well, it's found in the Old Testament, because that's what the Jews were supposed to do. They were supposed to take the Word of God and put it on their right hand and on their forehead. Now, it didn't really mean they were supposed to slap it on there and so forth, although Jews today, if you notice some Orthodox Jews that have these straps wrapped around their right hand, it has a Bible verse on it, and they have a little box that's strapped to their forehead.
Shema.
That's not what it's all about. You are to for the things that you do with your hand and the things that you do with your mind, thinking on these things, a renewed mind and so forth, you use God's Word. And so John, writing to a Jewish audience, is using that type of language. Of course, this is revealed to him. So, but notice what it says. It doesn't say you're going to this is put in your hand or in your forehead. It's on your hand. And why would you need a microchip to put 666 on somebody's hand? If you interpret the Bible literally, that's all it says. You got to put 666 on somebody's hand. Then the other problem is, if the 666 and the mark of the beast is in fact a microchip, then what do you do with Revelation chapter 14? Here's verse 17. And it provides that no one should be able to buy or sell or accept the one who has the mark, either the name of the beast or the number of his name. Here is wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for the number is that of a man, and his number is 666. Now, if this is talking about modern day technology, you got a problem with the very next verse in the very next chapter of Revelation chapter 14, verse 1. It says, and I looked, and behold, the Lamb was standing on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000, having his name and the name of his Father written on their foreheads. So if the mark of the beast is a microchip in Revelation 13, 17, and 18, then you have to assume that the mark of the Lamb written on their foreheads is also a microchip. Well, we know that's crazy. This isn't about microchips. This is about theology. This is about a theological understanding of the number 666. Now, there are two ways of looking at this. There are two beasts. One's the one that comes out of the sea, which is Rome. There's one that comes up out of the land, which is Israel. Remember, they colluded together to crucify Jesus. Remember, the Jews cried out, we have no king but Caesar. And so you have Rome against the church, and you have the apostate Jews against the church. And there is some good indication that the number 666, if you take Nero's name, put him in Hebrew characters, you get 666. But you also get Solomon's number. So if you go back to, I think it's 1 Kings chapter 10, Solomon, you will see the number 666 there. And I think it's 1 Kings 10. Every other number in that chapter is a round number. This is the only time it's used as a non-round number, 666. In the very next chapter, 1 Kings chapter 11, what does Solomon do? He marries foreign wives. And it's just like in the New Testament, where Israel, in a sense, weds itself to Rome in opposition to the church. And so you got that number applying to Nero Kaiser, Neron Kaiser, and you also have it related to Solomon, who abandoned God, married foreign wives, and basically apostatized at the end. So that takes care of the theological side of this. Now, what about microchips and so forth and so on? Here's the question I ask. If Revelation 13 and if Revelation 13 was not in the Bible, would you think having the government implant a microchip in you was a good idea?
I personally wouldn't.
Okay. It would be a stupid idea, and we would be foolish if the government says, we're going to microchip you or we're going to mark you in some way. I mean, look what the Nazis did to the Jews.
Yeah.
So you don't need the Bible. You don't need the Bible to be wise with these types of things. If that prophecy was never there, we as Christians should be smart enough to say, this is tyrannical, and we don't want to do it. And by the way, this microchip story that's taking place isn't being done by government. It's being done by a company that wants to keep track of people in their lunchroom or something. It's absolutely stupid, and people are stupid if they take this. And if the government wants to put a microchip in us, we should protest it with all of our strength. And we could make an application from Revelation chapter 13 But that's not what Revelation is dealing with. So we can be wise as serpents, as gentle as doves, and not be, every time something like this comes up, always start saying it's the end of the world. So that's my kind of brief deal on this.
Right. Awesome.
Awesome, dude. Well, Brent, thanks for calling in, and I really appreciate your post and what you're doing, man. So keep that up.
Yeah, I appreciate being a part of it. Thanks.
Thank you, man. Honored to have you. And if anybody else has, I've got maybe one or two more questions, then we're going to go ahead and wrap things up. And if anybody has any more questions, we'd love you to just say, hey, where you're calling from. Just hit 5-star on your phone, 5-star, and we'll bring you on real quick. Thanks, everybody, so far. Now, while people are clicking that, if they have a question, I want to ask the question related to the passage that you know very well, 1 Thessalonians 4:13 through 18. That is the verse, Gary, that gets brought up every time somebody wants to defend the pre-tribulation rapture. You can almost hear it coming from 1,000 miles away. You know it's coming. It's not a
now, which one is it now? Which verse?
1 Thessalonians 4:13 through 18.
Yeah.
And so what would you say to a futurist that would say this is clearly teaching a pre-tribulation rapture?
Well, I would say first off, the history of the church has used that passage as a future passage. I mean, it's always been viewed as a future passage. Now, there are a lot of full preterists out there who see this as related to events prior to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, and they may have a good case for it. I don't like their exegesis on the passage. I think it has some good points, but I still have lots of questions about it. But keep in mind that the church has always viewed 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 as something that takes place in the future. What the people who believe in a rapture have to understand is the very doctrine of a rapture, as this passage is talking about, a rapture is the issue. And the whole idea of a rapture, a pre-tribulational rapture, comes from Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 through 27, and 70 weeks of years, where they put a gap in time between the end of the 69th week and the beginning of the 70th week. So they put a gap between 483 years, which they say we're living in right now, and the gap we're living in now. And then then the rapture supposedly takes place. And get this, there are 5 different rapture positions. Now, either the rapture takes place before the 70th week. The 70th week would be 7 years. Either takes place before the 7 years, takes place in the middle of the 70 years, takes place at the end of the seventh year, or there are people there's a partial rapture, and then that there are those who believe in a pre-wrath rapture. So there are 5 different rapture positions. And so if the pre-tribulationists can get their other 4 rapture positions to agree with one another on all this, we might have a sound debate. But all the rapture positions base their position on the prophecy clock stopping at the end of the 69th week, at the 483rd year of the prophecy, and then there being a gap of nearly 2,000 years before the 70th week, the final 7 years starts up. And yet there is nothing in Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 through 27, that says there is a gap between the 69th and the 70th week. You have to remember that Daniel chapter 9, Daniel is reading Jeremiah's prophecy about the 70 years of captivity. Remember, they go into captivity for 70 years. And then Daniel gets this prophecy of 70 weeks of years. Now, was there a gap between the 69th and the 70th week of the exile? There wasn't. Can you imagine? They get down to the 69th year, and these old men, finally saying, "Look, we're going to get back to the land." the 69th year is over. You know, one or two generations were born during this period of time and said, we're going to go back to the land. We have one more year to go. And then finally, the 70th year, they're still in captivity. And they said, well, maybe we miscalculated. Maybe we need to wait another year. And no, we're still not back in the land. Another year. And finally someone said, we need to ask God. And God said, oh, I forgot to tell you guys. I put a gap between the 69th and the 70th year of the captivity. I'm not counting the gap. I'm only going to count the first 69 years of the captivity and then the 70th year, but I haven't gotten to the 70th year yet. We would say, this is crazy. So why would God give a prophecy of 70 weeks of years based upon the 70 years of captivity and put a gap between the 69th and 70th week of nearly 2,000 years in length, which is absolutely ridiculous. So the idea of a rapture is different from the second coming. That the First Thessalonians 4 has always been about the second coming, that Jesus will come again to judge the quick and the dead. The whole idea of a pre-trib, mid-trib, post-trib, partial rapture, or pre-wrath rapture is based upon the idea that there is a gap between the 69th and the 70th week of Daniel's prophecy, a prophecy that never, ever mentions a gap. The 70th week follows the 69th week. Jesus is crucified in the middle of the 70th week, and then for the next 3.5 years, the gospel goes to Israel, and then finally it goes to the Gentiles, and Peter is given this prophecy about how the gospel is supposed to go to the Gentiles. That's the end of the 70th week. Bang, that's the end of it. And there's no gap, there's no parenthesis, there's no pre-trib rapture, no mid-trib rapture, no post-trib rapture, no partial rapture, no pre-wrath rapture. The Bible doesn't teach any of that. And every pre-tribber and post-tribber will acknowledge there isn't a single verse in the New Testament that says anything about the church being raptured prior to, in the middle of, or at the end of a tribulation period. There's not a single verse that teaches it anywhere. Even 1 Thessalonians 4 doesn't mention anything about a gap or anything like that, or the church being taken off the earth. None of that. It's all made up. It was all made up in the 19th century, and it's been foisted on the church today, and unfortunately too many people believe it. It's myth.
Absolutely. I do believe that as well at this point. I did for a long time, and also you made some very valid points. And with Daniel's 70 weeks, just what I always tell people is, what number comes after 69? 70. I mean, who counts? Yeah. Who's counting to 70 and then just unnaturally just stops and says, well, I feel like I need to wait here. No, I mean, if there was something in the text in Daniel 9 that indicated a gap, that's one thing. But if not, then we have to assume, just like in counting to 70, 70 comes after 69. And also in 1 Thessalonians 4, what I like to point out is also, there's, and I've heard you say this, Gary, several times, is there's nothing in here that says that it's the church that's taken off the earth or caught up here. And where's the 7-year tribulation period? It doesn't mention here. Where's the Antichrist? Where's the rebuilt temple? Where is anything of the dispensational system in 1 Thessalonians 4? None of it is here. And also, like you said, if you look historically of how this has been interpreted throughout the centuries, it literally, like you said, was the 19th century before people started to have this view, which means that the Bible doesn't naturally teach that. Otherwise, people would have come to that conclusion much sooner. So absolutely. So I love what you said on that. And we're going to put one more person in for a question. Okay?
Well, let me make two short comments. We have to keep in mind that the dispensationalists believe that God's going to deal with Israel again after the church is raptured. What many of them don't tell you is that during this tribulation period, 2/3 of the Jews living in Israel are going to be slaughtered. And based upon Zechariah chapter 13, verse 8. So for 2,000 years, God postpones dealing with Israel, and all of a sudden God's going to deal with Israel again. And I brought this up with Dr. Brown. So finally God's going to deal with Israel again, and then he's going to unleash another Holocaust on the Jews so that 2/3 of them living in Israel are going to be slaughtered. There's 7 million Jews in Israel today. Figure out how many that is. You're talking about nearly 5 million Jews are going to be slaughtered as part of, some end time prophecy fulfillment. The second thing is, you remember the passage where it says about forgiving. He says, I tell you, not 7 times, but 70 times 7. And I think Jesus is actually making a reference to that for 490 years, Jesus is, he's brought this message to Israel, and for, 490 years, Israel there's a lead up to the coming of the Messiah, and the Messiah has come. That's the end point of it all. If you don't embrace Jesus as the promised Messiah, you stay in Jerusalem, you are going to be caught up in the greatest tribulation that has ever happened to the covenant nation of Israel. The 490 years are over for Israel. Embrace Jesus as the promised Messiah, which tens of thousands, probably millions of Jews actually did throughout the Roman Empire at that particular period of time.
That makes perfect sense. Absolutely. Makes a lot more sense than the other understanding. And, it's like, how can you say you have a hope for Israel whenever your end time paradigm says that 2/3 of them are going to be slaughtered?
Yeah.
So
I know.
I mean, yeah, it doesn't sound very hopeful there. So thank you for clarifying that. And guys, everybody that's listening, just so you know, just thank you guys for taking this time. I know that if you guys are having anywhere near as much fun as I'm having, listening to Gary just gives this amazing insight and understanding. I know that you're having a good time, and you're also being equipped. I enjoyed what Michelle said, so we all kind of walked away with some tools about how to present this to you, just to have patience and just keep planting the seed. And but we're going to take one more call real quick, and at the end we're going to do a quick book giveaway. All you have to do is be on the call, and I'm going to pick a random person. I'm literally going to close my eyes, and I have a big list of numbers here, everybody that's called in. I'm going to stop, and if you get it, I'm going to email you Last Days Madness, which is Gary's book that whenever I got this, it just revolutionized my understanding. He literally takes almost every topic, if not every topic, that you can address in prophecy, and he's got a chapter on it. So just hang around for just another minute here, and we got one more question, Gary. So hold on one second. Hey there.
Hey, this is Adam Marshak calling in from Newport, Kentucky, right next to Cincinnati, Ohio.
Hey, Adam. How are you, man?
Doing well. How are you guys?
Good.
Doing well, man. Thanks for calling in, brother.
All right. Yeah. This is more of a comment than a question, but it could turn into a question if you have anything to add. And please forgive me if this point has already been brought up, but in speaking about the last days, I just wanted to point out that I think it's important to ask the question, the last days of what? Maybe that was already brought out, but it's often
it's very good question. Yeah, the last days of what? And do you have a comment on that? Do you want me to comment on it?
Oh no, yeah, thanks. I'll comment a little bit first, and then feel free to add something to it. But it's often assumed that it's the last days of the end of the world, but I think we would be in agreement that it was actually speaking of the last days of the Old Covenant age, and of Israel's age. And on that note, probably the first mention of the last days, I believe, is in Genesis 49, where it says in verse 1, Jacob called his sons and said, "Gather together, that I may tell you what shall befall you in the last days." And Jacob, of course, was renamed Israel, and the things that he went on to tell them didn't happen in their lifetime, but I think that was a reference to the last days of ancient Israel. And also in Deuteronomy 31:29, Moses gave a warning and said, "I know that after my death you will act corruptly and turn from the way which I have commanded you, and evil will befall you in the latter days." And a similar statement is made in Jeremiah 30:24, and perhaps you know of other precedents in the Old Testament where the last days are mentioned in the context of Israel's last days, of latter-day judgment coming to Israel.
Yeah, the book of Hebrews, which of course is a directive on the passing away of the old covenant and the springing up of the new covenant in Jesus. I mean, no longer bulls, blood of bulls and goats. Jesus is the new priest. He's the new temple, as we saw in John chapter 2. So the book of Hebrews is, in fact, the book about the passing away of that old covenant. And the book of Hebrews begins with that statement. In verse 1, it says, God, after he spoke long ago to the fathers and the prophets in many portions and in many ways, in these last days has spoken to us in his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, through whom also he made the ages. Most translations have world, but the real better translation there is, in fact, ages. And then if you go to Hebrews chapter 9 somewhere here, it says, verse 26. Yeah, otherwise he would have needed to suffer often since the foundation of the world. But now, once at the consummation of the ages, he has been manifested to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. And so with Jesus completes all of the old covenant. I mean, the big debate that took place when Stephen was executed was the fact that Jesus was the completion of that, and they could not give up the old covenant. And with the raising of the temple, if they didn't give it up voluntarily, God was going to tear it down because it was an affront to Jesus being the temple. Destroy this temple, and I will raise it back up again. And Jesus was talking about the temple of Jesus' body. You can't have a competitor on earth. And so that all, in fact, passed away.
Amen.
Awesome. Well, Adam, thanks for that, man. You got anything else?
Well, maybe just one more comment on that. It's well established from what we just discussed that the last days were already present during the ministry of Jesus. And if there's any doubt that they were not to extend for another 2,000 years, we see statements from Peter and John. Peter in 1 Peter 4:7 said, "The end of all things is at hand." And John in 1 John 2:18 said, "Little children, it is the last hour." So in his lifetime was already the last hour of those last days.
Yeah.
See, I'm glad you said
Peter 1. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry to interrupt. I was going to say, that was actually the question that I was about to ask Gary is, you've got a lot of people that say, yeah, well, the last days started in the first century. You got Hebrews 1, Jesus appeared in these last days, but they say, but we've been in the last days for 2,000 years now, and that's going to continue until the end of time. But you're saying those two time statements given by Peter and John say that, where the end of all things is at hand, which means it's so close you can touch it. And that this is in the first century, and that, they're in the last hour. I mean, how long can an hour last 2,000 years? So clearly their understanding was not the last days of planet Earth, because we're still here. That they obviously had a different understanding. And if you understand, like Gary said, the book of Hebrews, the closing off of the old covenant world, leading up to where it's just the new covenant, the old system of redemptive animal sacrifice is gone, it makes sense that they saw the end of their world coming to a close, the old covenant world, but not the end of planet Earth, especially with the prophecies that Jesus gave in the temple in Matthew 21 through 23. I mean, he said all the righteous blood on earth is going to be poured out on this generation, and gave parable after parable, saying God was, or the parable of the vineyard owner is going to send his armies and destroy those murderers and set their city on fire. So there's so much that would have led them to believe that they were in the last days of that old covenant way of relating to God versus our assumption of the end of planet Earth. So absolutely.
Yeah. Jesus said, very clearly that the people he was talking to understood that Jesus was talking about them, because in the Matthew chapter 21 it says, when the chief priests and the Pharisees heard his parables, they understood that he was speaking about them. And see, what's happened is that the dispensationalists, there's a holdout for another indictment judgment against Israel. Their position puts modern day Jews in jeopardy of another Holocaust, because during that tribulation period, 2/3 of the Jews are going to be slaughtered. And you would think, because they believe that, they would be telling Jews, instead of going to Israel, and they get all excited about that, they should be telling them to leave. Jesus, in fact, did tell them, Matthew chapter 24, to leave. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, this is Luke's version, get out of the city, head for the hills, go outside of Judea, which means it was a local judgment. So Jesus warned them over a 40-year period. They were warned. You see these things happen, this judgment is going to come upon this generation. There's no doubt about this. And you're going to see it happen when Jerusalem is surrounded by armies. And Jerusalem was, in fact, surrounded by armies, and there was a time for them to leave. And those who left were saved. Those who did not leave were, in fact, there was a monumental bloodbath. And there's even the story of a woman who was starving to death there. And these Roman soldiers came in, and they smelled something burning. And this woman had, in fact, sacrificed, basically killed her own child because she was starving to death, and offered these hardened Roman soldiers the baby's flesh to eat. That's how horrible this was. And what the dispensationalists are saying is that this is going to happen again. And that's a view that's something that we need to really fight against, because it puts modern day Jews in jeopardy. And the dispensationalists say, oh, don't worry about it. We're going to escape it all, because this is all going to happen after we're raptured out of here. So anyway, there's so much more to discuss. And again, if anybody is interested in this topic, they can go to AmericanVision.org. They can order Last Days Madness. I will have a new book out just on Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21, called Wars and Rumors of Wars, which should be out possibly sometime in August of 2017.
Wow, well, I can't wait for that book. Again, it's called Wars and Rumors of Wars. And Adam, thank you so much for calling in, man. All right. Well, Michelle, are you able to take one more question from Michelle, Gary?
Sure.
Okay. Thank you so much for taking this time. Okay. Let's see here. Hey, Michelle. Let's see, get her on here. Okay. Michelle?
Hear me?
Yeah.
You hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much. I thought, do I dare ask another question? But after you were talking about Daniel and week 69 and the gap, and then you said, is an hour like 1,000 years? Like way back when you were talking about Daniel, I'm thinking the people here in South Bend would say, the Bible says a day is like 1,000 years. So, what do you say to them?
I hear that.
Well,
all the time,
answer for that.
Well, you have to remember, it says with God, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like a day, but not for us. So when God says this generation will pass away, you can't all of a sudden throw in that passage from Peter and say, well, with God, a day is 1,000 years, 1,000 years is a day, or an hour can be 2,000 years. It says for God, an hour is a day is like 1,000 years. So when God, and what they end up doing is these are the same people who claim to interpret the Bible literally. So when they see something, they see a passage about this generation, or words like near, shortly, and quickly, they'll take that passage from Peter, which has nothing to do with words like near, shortly, and quickly in this generation. And so all of a sudden they become people who don't interpret the Bible literally. So near actually means far, quickly means slow, and at hand means, someplace way down the road. You can't go around quoting the Bible, like that. There's lots of things that God knows and does that's way different from ours. God's love is different from our kind of love, because God loves unconditionally. We love conditionally. So I'm always amazed when people who say they interpret the Bible literally pull that verse out of a hat and say, so what you're saying is, and so when Jesus said that on the third day he'll be raised from the dead, so he really hasn't been raised from the dead yet because only 2 days have passed, 2,000 years. We got to wait another 1,000 years for that to happen. Or he was 3 days and 3 nights in the center of the earth, and so okay. So he's still there because you said a day is 1,000 years, 1,000 years is a day. So anyway, that's a couple of things you can use.
Yes, that's the perfect way to put it. I'm stealing that from you, Gary. And also, what
Me
it is.
too.
Yeah, everybody's stealing that. But I hear that all the time as well. And what it is it's a way to try to discount the time statement. But the way that you answer it is what Gary said, is consistency. Well, why are you choosing to apply a day is like 1,000 years, 1,000 years like a day to that statement? Well, what about in Galatians 1:18? Paul says, and after 3 years I went up to Jerusalem to see Peter. Okay? Well, if every day of that 3 years was 1,000 years, then that means that Paul hasn't even seen Peter yet, and he won't for a long time. So it reveals that.
Or it could have been 3 years, could be 3 days. So it happened in 3 days. So you're right. Yeah. Here's what I did. I went and got a concordance out and I looked up every single word that the near, shortly, and quickly, and I see how they were used in every other context. And I said, look, here you have this preponderance of usage of what this word means, and then you're going to pull a verse out of Peter, has nothing to do with this, and say, but on these verses, these I've cherry-picked because they deal with my prophetic system, and I'm going to apply that to that. So near, when John is told that time is near, it really doesn't mean near. It means it could mean a couple thousand years. It makes absolutely no sense. Because what's interesting is that Daniel is told, he's given this prophecy, he's told to seal up the prophecy because it's going to be many days in the future, many years in the future. Where the book of Revelation, John is told, don't seal up the prophecy for the time is near. And so there we get a good indication of what near means. Don't seal this up. Daniel sealed it up, and it was 600 years in the future before that was fulfilled. John is told, don't seal it up. Why? Because the prophecy in the book of Revelation was near to take place. It was about to take place. So anyway,